Welcome to the Plenary Panel. We're very excited for this Plenary Panel on a very significant anniversary for us. So the panel, Constructing the First Folio. I want to alert you that there is a linked seminar on Saturday, the 1623 First Folio, if you want to audit that seminar. And I'm Bernadette, Andrea. I already introduced myself to you at the dinner. And I am going to introduce the speakers as they appear on the program. But before I introduce the speakers, I just want to let you know that microphones are set up in the aisle for the question and answer period. If you have any concerns about mobility, please just put up your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you. Also, I know we all have our teacher voices and can project, but it's important to use the microphone for accessibility issues. It's not that easy for everybody to hear, especially in every corner of the room. So if you would, please use the microphone for your questions. So let me proceed to introduce our speakers in order. We have an illustrious array of speakers, beginning with Amy Lidster, who is a departmental lecturer in English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford. Professor Lidster's work has appeared in journals and edited collections, and she is the author of 3 monographs, publishing The History Play in the Time of Shakespeare, Stationer's Shaping of a Genre from 2022, Wartime Shakespeare, Performing Narratives of Conflict, 2023, and forthcoming is Authorships and Authority in Early Modern Dramatic Paratexts. And she wanted to let everyone know she was a next-gen Plen speaker at SAA in 2019. No, she's on the plenary stage. Jitka Štollová, thank you, is a junior research fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, and previously held the same position at Jesus College, Oxford. Her articles appear in journals including English Literary Renaissance, the Review of English Studies, and Studies in Philology. Her first monograph will explore the portrayal of Richard III in the 17th century. She is also interested in paratext and book history. Beyond the Renaissance, she researches the plays and essays by former Czech President Václav Havel. And our third speaker is Gary Taylor, who is Lawton Distinguished University Professor in the English Department at Florida State University. He has worked with different teams of editors on the Oxford Shakespeare Complete Works, 1986, and the Oxford Middleton Collected Works, 2007, and the new Oxford Shakespeare Complete Works, 2016-17. He is currently working with another team on the new Oxford Shakespeare Complete Alternative Versions, which is scheduled to be published in print and online in 2025. This session was organized by Emma Smith of Hertford College, University of Oxford. She, as we all know, has worked on the First Folio, including her book, Shakespeare's First Folio, 4 Centuries of an Iconic Book. And it has a new anniversary edition from Oxford University Press, available right now. And I would like to invite Professor Smith to say a few words about the panel before we proceed.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. When I set up this panel, it was in a kind of self-denying ordinance, and I thought I'm not going to say anything at all, but I've slightly stepped back from that. But I've only got 2 minutes to set the scene. I'm really delighted these great scholars have agreed to talk about the First Folio. So, 400 years since the first folio was printed. Without this book, perhaps we would now be at the JAA, or perhaps the BFAA, or indeed with our friends and colleagues at the Marlowe Society of America. We'd be chatting in between seminars about whether anybody had ever tried pairing A King and No King with the little-known Richard II, or whether Midsummer Night's Dream teaches well. I think we tend to understand the first folio, or to make claims for it in this anniversary year, in terms of the what if, and in terms of loss. What would we have lost? No Macbeth, we say, no Tempest, no friends, Romans, and countrymen. But just for a minute, I wanted to reconfigure that narrative of loss into one of permission and possibility. I think we tend to see the first folio as a monument, the canon between two covers. But its claims, I think, are much more provisional, more contingent, and more enabling than that. And I'm going to just take a minute to talk about Timon of Athens. We know that Timon of Athens was not part of the original plan for the first folio. It was included only in a panic when it seemed that Troilus and Cressida was not going to be available after all. The catalogue to this book has already been typeset and printed when the rights to Troilus are belatedly secured. So, without the folio, no Timon. But more significantly, since there's no other record of Timon before 1623, we wouldn't know we didn't have it. It would be as if Donald Rumsfeld was contributing to the fabulous Lost Plays database under the heading Unknown Unknowns. I think that glimpse gives us just a momentary access to a folio that embodies a Shakespeare that's more contingent and more pragmatic. Far from fixing the Shakespeare canon, this is a book that attests to its ongoing fluidity and mutability. Of course, we don't need permission from this work to distribute Shakespearean authority more widely, but if we did, the folio would give it. It's in the spirit, I think, of the folio's radical contingency and incompleteness that we proposed this panel for the anniversary year. Thank you very much for being here, and any potential founder members of the BFAA might want to meet in the bar afterwards.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm here to talk to you today a bit about the folio and construction of authorship. The 1623 First Folio packages Shakespeare as the sole author of his work, and in a way that activates the two main senses of the term: author as a creator or originator of something, and author as someone with authority who approves, controls, authorizes. It is a construction about which Shakespeare himself is very silent. Published 7 years after his death, the folio was a collaboration produced in his absence, involving the King's Men, represented by John Hemmings and Henry Condell, and the publishing syndicate of William and Isaac Jaggard, Edward Blunt, William Aspley, and John Smethwick. Its title page engraving and possessive title, Master William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies, present Shakespeare as the single creator of the plays contained in the volume. Its dedication and commendatory verses describe Shakespeare as the sole father to his issue, now his orphans, and he is also presented as his own guarantor of their quality. Readers are warned that if you do not like him, surely you are in some manifest danger not to understand him. In their address to the great variety of readers, Hemmings and Condell further privilege Shakespeare's authority by ascribing most value to the play scripts as they left Shakespeare's hand, where the contributions and corruptions, as they present it, of others cannot be found. The fact that the Folio syndicate used as copy some of the earlier editions of Shakespeare's plays that had already appeared in print, the stolen and surreptitious copies that they seem to castigate, suggests these claims are a marketing strategy designed to promote the new collection and make a case for the superiority of the authorial script or the author's papers. The Folio constructs a model of solitary, monolithic authorship that is inaccurate. Its construction elides the contributions of co-writers, revisers, such as Peel in Titus Andronicus, Fletcher for Henry VIII, and Middleton for Macbeth, to give just a few examples of the dramatists believed to have contributed to the Folio plays. While Shakespeare does seem to have often worked alone, his fellow company members, Hemmings and Condell, would certainly have seen theatre as an inherently collaborative process involving a range of contributors, sources, and stages of revision and revival. By locating Shakespeare in absentia as the main authority for his plays, as an agent of both creation and control, the Folio offers a packaging of dramatic authorship that has proved exceptionally influential, owing to the subsequent prominence and cultural capital of the volume and its author. But when situating the Folio in its own time as an historical document and printing project of the 1620s, it is clear that it cannot be taken as a touchstone for understanding dramatic authorship, including Shakespeare's. In this talk, I'm going to show first that the Folio responds to earlier print representations of Shakespeare's authorship in playbooks that predated its publication. Second, that the model of a single author is not the only one that is developed and marketed within commercial playbooks from the period. And finally, that the Folio compromises its own logic and its claims about Shakespeare's position as sole author and authority. I'm going to concentrate on playbook paratexts, especially what I call discursive paratexts, such as dedications, addresses to readers, and commendatory verses, to suggest that they are vital sites for negotiating ideas of authorship avant la lettre. They are textual spaces where multiple, overlapping, and sometimes competing authorities position themselves or are positioned by others in roles of creation and control over the play, offering an early dialectic of authorship for early modern drama. Shakespeare's voice is not only absent from the paratext of the Folio, it is absent from all the paratexts of his plays published during his lifetime. Shakespeare authored 2 dedications for his narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and Lucrece, but did not contribute any preliminary materials to his or any other dramatist's playbooks. We don't know what Shakespeare thought about his work as a playwright and the print publication of his plays. In Shakespeare's playbooks, we find within the paratexts the voices of others, and while their identities and agendas were invariably diverse, often unknown and unknowable, what seems to emerge is an emphasis on Shakespeare as sole author and authorizer, as we find in the Folio. We can locate this emerging negotiation, this dialectic of authorship, through title page attribution practices, seen here in the title page to King Lear, and through the few examples of discursive paratexts that appear in Shakespearean playbooks prior to the Folio. While some of the earliest plays appeared anonymously, Shakespeare was first advertised as author on the title page of playbooks in 1598. For the second editions of Richard II and Richard III, published by Andrew Wise, and the first extant edition of Love's Labour's Lost, published by Cuthbert Burby. Wise's editions, which included the first part of Henry IV, proved popular with readers, judging by their numerous reprints, and they helped to establish the marketability of Shakespearean authorship, which was not inevitable but ultimately contingent on book trade success. By 1600, Shakespeare was, as Lucas Erne has shown, the most attributed commercial dramatist in print, and by 1623, 47 playbook editions feature his name on their title pages, sometimes accompanied by claims of correction or expansion. Love's Labour's Lost, for example, is described as newly corrected and augmented by W. Shakespeare, which seems to link his name with the initial creation of the play, as well as its later revision and preparation for publication. The second quarto of Hamlet in 1604 prominently advertises Shakespeare's authorship and makes a claim for the authority of the new edition that has been prepared according to the true and perfect copy, initiating that high valuation of Shakespeare's elusive authorial manuscripts. Shakespeare's name never appears alongside of that of a collaborator's until The Two Noble Kinsmen. Pericles, published in 1609 and thought to be a collaboration with George Wilkins, is only attributed to Shakespeare. Before the Folio, only 2 Shakespearean playbooks, Troilus and Cressida and Othello, contained discursive paratexts, both written by their publishers. In these, Shakespeare, to the exclusion of other agents, is presented as the sole authority for the plays. Published in 1609, one issue of Troilus and Cressida features an address, a never writer to an ever reader, contributed by Richard Bonnion and Henry Whalley, who claim that this author's comedies are so framed to the life that they serve for the most common commentaries of all the actions of our lives. The publishers advise book buyers to invest in Shakespeare now because his plays will become sought-after commodities after his death. Believe this, that when he is gone and his comedies out of sale, you will scramble for them and set up a new English Inquisition. This address is a marketing ploy to increase the desirability of the playbook and help the publishers to turn a profit. It constructs Shakespeare as an important and valuable author whose success does not depend on the novelty of his plays, but on their lasting quality. The address is to a significant degree performative. Bonnion and Whalley privilege Shakespeare's authority over the printed book, despite his paratextual silence, and downplay their own. They describe themselves modestly as never writers, but they have authored this discursive paratext that occupies an eye-catching position at the beginning of the playbook, a distinct act of authorship that establishes Bonnie and Whalley as authorizing agents, eager to control the printed book's reception and profitability. Similarly, Thomas Walkley's 1622 edition of Othello claims that Shakespeare has created a play of high quality and that the authority of his name will guarantee its success as a printed book. To commend it, I will not. For that which is good, I hope every man will commend without entreaty. And I am the bolder because the author's name is sufficient to vent his work. But Walkley's refusal to praise is something of a paralipsis, as despite the epistle's measured tone, the function of the form is to provide commendation. And as Adam Hooks proposes, the very existence of the preface contradicts Walkley's claim that Shakespeare's name alone is sufficient to guarantee a profit. Walkley aims to establish Shakespeare as the main authority for Othello, while in practice the playbook reveals the contributions of multiple agents that strive to secure its printed afterlife. While the 1623 Folio is an exceptional venture, the first collection printed in folio format to consist only of plays from the commercial stages, it needs to be seen alongside these earlier publications that advance a model of solitary authorship in which Shakespeare is packaged by others as the central authorizing figure for his plays, but which, on closer inspection, reveals their contributions to the playbooks alongside and as collaborators with Shakespeare. Looking beyond Shakespeare, this construction of dramatic authorship was not the only one that was available and marketable during the period. While Ben Jonson regularly insisted upon his own status as sole author of his plays in print, many other publications were anonymous or advertised the collaborative nature of dramatic authorship. In Marlowe's Tamburlaine, publisher Richard Jones claims in his address to the gentlemen readers that he has improved or corrected the plays for an elite readership, having purposely omitted and left out some fond and frivolous gestures, digressing and, in my poor opinion, far unmeet for the matter. While it is difficult to verify this claim in the absence of play scripts, the paratext puts forward a model of plural authorities and implies that model is marketable and meaningful. Marlowe, the author, is unnamed and absent. Jones has edited the plays and acts as a guarantor of quality, and an implied gentlemanly readership is tasked with interpretation and judgment. In other cases, individuals connected to the playhouses are positioned as collaborators, and the word actor is linked to author through a similar Latin-French etymology and a set of shared meanings, such as agent, advocate, and instigator. John Marston's paratexts often embrace the theatrical origins of his plays, leading him to question the merits of print publication. In his address to my equal reader in Parastaster or the Faun, Marston claims that the life of his comedy rests much in the actor's voice and sets up drama as a collaboration between playwright and actor, next to whom the authority of the printed book is compromised. A play is an unstable textual commodity, and it is only because this play cannot avoid publishing that Marston has been my own setter out. In If It Be Not Good, The Devil Is In It, Thomas Dekker dedicates the play to Queen Anne's men who performed it and praises the contributions of the actors, concluding that for the playbook, he finds none more fit, none more worthy to patronize this than you who have protected it. The actors guarded the play in performance, and in print they are positioned as patrons who authorize its quality through their prior success. Publisher Walter Burr's dedication to Robert Keyser, manager of the Children of the Queen's Revels, in Francis Beaumont's theatrical flop, Night of the Burning Pestle, presents a framework of multiple authorities via an extended metaphor of progeneration, in which the play's father, Beaumont, foster father, Keyser, and nurse, Burr, have nurtured the text, and in which Beaumont's role is the only anonymous one in the playbook, identified only by a general noun, father, rather than a proper noun. And some playbooks directly advertise the contributions of multiple authors, including Middleton and Rowley in A Fair Quarrel, and Beaumont and Fletcher in A King and No King. One state of The Travels of the Three English Brothers contains a signed dedication to the Shirley family and their friends by the play's dramatists, John Day, William Rowley, and George Wilkins. The dedication exclusively uses the first person plural and implies that the dramatist's collaborative authorship cannot be prized apart and individual contributions identified. Interestingly, this collaboratively authored, or at least collectively attributed paratext was unusual. I've tabulated all discursive paratexts that appear in commercial playbooks between 1590 and 1623, which is available through this link on my Humanities Commons page, and it is the only example. Paratextual discourses of dramatic authorship less often involved collaborative contributions by a play's dramatists than those by other writers and stationers. These few examples demonstrate how a dialectic of authorship was emerging within the paratextual space of playbooks. Authorship could be conceptualized as collaborative in many more ways than this term is often seen to indicate. It could involve contributions from multiple dramatists, but also from actors, publication agents, other writers, dedicatees, and readers. Because these sometimes performative discourses emerged post hoc, their dominant concern tends to be the afterlife of the playbook, in authorizing responses to it and shaping its interpretation, desirability, and marketability as a printed book. While the Folio seems to affirm Shakespeare's position as sole authority over his work, its logic is compromised, A, by what we know about the nature of collaborative nature of early modern theatre, and the sourcing, correction, and presentation of copy within the book itself, and B, by some of the claims voiced in its discursive paratexts. The Folio prints texts that have been sourced from previous printed editions that involve the work of other dramatists and that have been corrected by other agents, including scribes and annotating readers connected to the printing house. It is a messier project than its most prominent claims about Shakespeare and his true original copies seem to indicate. The discursive paratexts also draw attention, as they do in Troilus and Cressida and Othello, to the agencies of others, and introduce a tension with the book's overriding interest in elevating Shakespeare as sole author and authority. Hemmings and Condell alternatively praise Shakespeare's work and then modestly dismiss them as trifles within their dedication to William and Philip Herbert. They assign prospective readers the authority to censure the plays as long as they buy them first, and then somewhat rescind that allowance by suggesting that if readers dislike the plays, they've not understood them. The Folio's paratexts, while most loudly proclaiming Shakespeare as prime authority, also map out a range of other authorizing agents. To give a final example, in his commendatory verse, Leonard Digges claims that Shakespeare's plays themselves, every line, each verse, shall ensure the dramatist lives eternally, a commonplace trope that Shakespeare's sonnets also explore. The sonnets, however, establish the writer's immortality through the text, which could be reproduced and circulated in different material forms, including manuscript and print. The commendatory verses fetishize the folio as the definitive book or document of Shakespeare's work that is dependent on its materiality in this instance. The commendatory verse announces the collection as a superior commodity within the book trade, and one that will outlive another material form, the dramatis Stratford monument of brass and marble. It positions the folio as a book unmediated by non-authorial agents, but this is a conception created by others other than the absent dramatist. Shakespeare, as monolithic authority, was a post hoc product overseen by collaborative networks of individuals within the book trade who confirm the dramatist's primacy, but establish their own. In summary, I've proposed in this talk that playbook paratexts are a vital site where the concept of authorship is differently and sometimes collaboratively negotiated during the period, and that the 1623 folio offers just one example of that, and not, in fact, a representative one. The folio shapes how we approach Shakespearean authorship. It makes us begin with Shakespeare, the single author. That's the story it writes for us. And we have to work to recover evidence of the contribution of others in order to understand this historical document. It is a model that has also become the starting point for thinking about early modern dramatic authorship more broadly. We search for the individuated author as default, supplementing that with evidence of collaboration. In his opening verse, Johnson implores readers not to look on Shakespeare's picture, but on his book. And perhaps the folio, when we look closely, implores us not to look on its packaging of solitary authorship, clearly promoted here through the engraving, but on the messier story of construction and collaboration that the book really reveals, and how that could change the questions we ask and our starting point for thinking about authorships of early modern drama. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It is a great honor and privilege to be here at the Shakespeare Association of America conference in the year of the folio, to be on a panel about the constructing the first folio 400 years after the actors John Hamming and Henry Condell, together with a syndicate of London stationers, put together a dramatic collection which would end up becoming one of the most fundamental books in our culture. Without it, 18 plays by Shakespeare would have been lost. We would have no Prospero, no Macbeth, and, tragically, no Malvolio in yellow stockings. In a more expansive manner, through the legacy of the folio and the way it shaped Shakespeare as a point of reference, we would miss out on some of the most exciting contemporary works which are inspired by his plays and poems. A case in point is the last play written by the former Czech president Václav Havel. The only work completed after he left the office, his play called Leaving, is very heavily inspired by King Lear, as well as Anton Pavlovich Chekhov's The Cherry Orchard. I remember talking to Havel exactly 1 year before he died, discussing his inspiration in Shakespeare. And I remember how moved I was watching this man, an icon of dissent, a political prisoner of 4 years, a statesman asked to address both chambers of Congress, very shortly after the Velvet Revolution, someone so instrumental in helping my home country, the Czech Republic, join NATO in 1999. The full significance of this alliance has become clear only very recently due to tragic circumstances in Ukraine. I remember listening to this man of such experience, with such a reputation, at that point very frail and very ill. I listened to him reflecting on the profound existential anxiety of a man exposed to the elements during the storm in King Lear. That is one of those passages that he took over from Shakespeare. It would not be accurate to say that without the folio, we wouldn't have adaptations like this. After all, King Lear was previously published in quarto. But the folio helped create the narrative of Shakespeare that continued to inspire generations of writers centuries after it was published. For me, personally, meeting Václav Havel played a fundamental role in my decision to focus on early modern studies and Shakespeare. But equally, through a different kind of inspiration, I would not be standing here without the impressive effort of scholars who have devoted years and years of both studying Shakespeare in the folio and spreading knowledge about him to the general public. I'm talking both about established scholars, early career scholars, and translators, without whom a play such as Havel's Leaving would not exist. If you care to know how long it takes to translate all Shakespeare, it is 26 years. We do have a translation in Czech, so it's a long enterprise. Well, we all know the story of the first folio. We are familiar with the dichotomy between the humble epistle to the patrons and their much blunter address to readers. But whatever you do, buy. Amy has shown how the first folio was constructed around the fictional model of Shakespeare's sole authorship, even though the dynamic beyond that is obviously much more complex. And I would like to follow up on that and discuss how the rhetoric of paratexts help frame the message of another dramatic folio. Without the 1623 folio, as I said, we wouldn't have Prospero, Macbeth, and Malvolio. What we also wouldn't have is the single most significant dramatic publication of the Civil War and the Interregnum, the folio of Francis Beaumont and John Fletcher, published by Humphrey Moseley in 1647. Here is a photo of the 4 Shakespeare folios alongside the Beaumont and Fletcher folio from the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge. And I hope this photo gives some sense of the size of these books. So much so that I actually really struggled to take a photo of them. When Humphrey Moseley decided to publish his folio, he chose to emulate Shakespeare's folio, not Johnson's, for example, even though Johnson's folio was reprinted in 1640. The parallels visually are really hard to miss. I will just put it back. I think you can see it quite well. Almost identical titles. There's the portrait, the title page. But the stationer really struggled to convey the collection as a work of 2 playwrights, Beaumont and Fletcher, because he didn't have Beaumont's portrait, even though he actually approached his family and even friends, as he says in his epistle. The instability of the writing duo would continue to haunt Moseley because, in addition to the missing portrait, he also was quite problematic in acknowledging, or rather not acknowledging, the contribution and collaboration of Fletcher's Fletcher with Chapman, Johnson, Shirley, Middleton, Shakespeare, and most notably Philip Messenger, for which he was actually very harshly scolded by another writer, Sir Aston Cockayne. The affiliation with Shakespeare's model is quite clear in the address to the patron. The Bowman and Fletcher Folio seeks the patronage of Philip, Earl of Pembroke and Montgomery, who, together with his brother William, were once patrons of the First Folio. The authors of the epistle actually invoke the sweet swan of Avon right on the first page of that epistle, and they are expressing hope that they will have similar success in getting support. However, despite the very obvious visual and textual connections between the collections, the Bowman and Fletcher Folio needed to define its own parameters. The First Folio aims to preserve Shakespeare's plays and create the identity of Shakespeare, secure his reputation, almost like a bibliographical casket with literary relics in it. Of course, Ben Jonson famously wrote, "Thou art a monument without a tomb, and art alive still, while thy book doth live." And the sentiment is echoed in Leonard Dick's poem, "When time dissolves thy Stratford monument, here we alive shall view thee still." Amid the Civil War, preserving the author's legacy through collected works would not be enough. Besides being a monument to Bowman and Fletcher, the dramatic collection makes a bold political statement against the Puritans while preserving itself as the nearest alternative to the closed theatres. It achieves so through a very ingenious and unprecedented use of paratexts that turn the folio into a bibliographical act of defiance against the silent stage. And calling this unprecedented is actually not an exaggeration, because while the Bowman and Fletcher Folio is slightly shorter than the Shakespeare Folio, it has roughly 880 pages to Shakespeare's roughly 920, it actually features considerably more prefatory material. In Jonson's folio, prefatory matters amount to about 1% of the pages. In Shakespeare's folio, it's about 2%. In the Bowman and Fletcher folio, it's 7%. And this is really significant because we need to realize that this paratextual material, these prefatory matters, are actually dispensable. Their inclusion increased the price of this volume because more paper was needed. And we are talking about the time when obviously the economy of the country was very strained. There were various increases in direct, indirect taxation, and royalists particularly were targeted. And of course, royalists were the assumed readers for this volume. And still, Moseley decided that 7% of the volume would be devoted to prefatory matters. And this included an address to a patron, 2 epistles to readers by the playwright James Shirley and Humphrey Moseley himself, and then 34 commendatory poems. That's a fascinating number. 34 poems match the number of plays printed in this volume. So, like a bibliographical conductor, Moseley orchestrated a textual performance that resounds in the void left by the closed theatres. When theatres are silenced, playbooks need to speak out. In their totality, these prefatory matters mounted a challenge to the world of clandestine drama. And the paratexts accomplished this in at least 4 distinct ways. They present the folio as the closest equivalent to watching a play. They frame the book as a safe harbor in the era of disturbance. They emulate the emotional experience of watching a play. And they serve as a rallying cry against anti-theatrical Puritan sentiments. And we shall see that Shakespeare's name was invoked like a charm to assist these efforts. In his address to readers, James Shirley invokes a pastoral scene where reading the folio brings comfort far from the madding crowd of Parliament-controlled London. And now, reader, in this tragical age where the theatre hath been so much outacted, congratulate thy own happiness that in this silence of the stage thou hast the liberty to read these inimitable plays, to dwell and converse in these immortal groves. Notice the emphasis on liberty. From this very peacefully ruminative moment, Shirley transposes the readers to the heightened emotions right in the middle of a drama. You may here find passions. I'm sorry, it didn't click. No, okay. You may here find passions raised to that excellent pitch and by such insinuating degrees that you shall not choose but consent and go along with them. He switches from the more formal you to the intimate thou, giving the repeated personal pronoun an almost hypnotic quality in inviting his readers into this fictional stage. And then he goes on, would thy melancholy have a cure? Thou shalt laugh at Democritus himself, and but reading one piece of this comic variety, find thy exalted fancy in Elysium. And when thou art sick of this cure, for the excess of delight may too much dilate thy soul, thou shalt meet almost in every leaf a soft purling passion, or spring of sorrow, so powerfully wrought high by the tears of innocence and wronged lovers, it shall persuade thy eyes to weep into the stream, and yet smile when they contribute to their own ruins. Through his careful rhetorical structuring, imagining the highs and lows, these emotional pitches that drama can reach, surely reminds the readers what they have lost following the closure of theatres. And this effect is starkly reminiscent to a passage in another play by Shirley called Love's Cruelty, where one character describes to another the emotional ravishment one supposedly experiences when watching a court masque, obviously, famously tantalizing, fascinating public display. Are you melancholy? A masque is prepared, and music to charm Orpheus himself into a stone. Numbers presented to your ear that shall speak the soul of the immortal English Johnson. In the height of this rapture, a tempest so artificial and sudden in the clouds, that you would cry out with a merriness in the work, you cannot escape drowning. In the turning of an eye, these waters ravish into a heaven, glorious and angelical shapes presented, the stars distinctly with their motion and music so enchanting you, that you would wish to be drowned indeed, to dwell in such a happiness. Following such an evocative epistle in the folio, as I said, the folio features 34 commendatory poems which celebrate the rich heritage of the English theatre, which stands in opposition to the restrictions imposed during the Civil War. And Shakespeare joins other deceased playwrights, Johnson, Chapman, and Fletcher, in an imaginary legion against Puritan sentiments. What? Now the stage is down, darest thou appear, bold Fletcher, in this tottering hemisphere? Had now grim Ben been breathing with what rage and high-sworn fury had he lashed this age, Shakespeare with Chapman had grown mad and torn their gentle sock and lofty buskins worn. And there are other commendatory poems which again invoke Shakespeare's name. So in conclusion, the Bowman and Fletcher folio illuminates the impact of the first folio and its role in solidifying Shakespeare's legacy during the mid-17th century. But of course, the significance of these two dramatic collections stretches way beyond that. In the year of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's folio, we can appreciate the importance of drama when performance is unavailable. We, too, have experienced our own silence of the stage during the pandemic. And so constructing the folio also includes considering not just the textual and the bibliographic legacy of these books, but the very concept that they embody, constructing. For instance, can we actually imagine the folio without having physical access to it? EBO is great, but it doesn't give us that scale. Living in a world after the pandemic, with the urgency of climate change that makes some people reconsider travel to rare book departments, for example, and with increasingly diminished funding in humanities to do this type of research, to access effectively these collections, we need to broaden our thinking about the folio or folios to accommodate challenges of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
The first words of the first folio are not by Shakespeare, but by Ben Jonson, and they instruct us to look not on his picture, but his book. Anyone looking at that book in 1623 could immediately see big, expensive, impressive. It's widely regarded as the single most important secular English book. We call it the first folio to distinguish it from later reprints, but the book's firstness was always fundamental to its identity. It's unlike any previous book associated with Shakespeare. No earlier English book had ever contained so many plays. No earlier English folio had been devoted exclusively to plays. Their unprecedented quality is emphasized throughout the preliminary pages. Jonson insists that they are superior to all the plays that insolent Greece and haughty Rome produced. The book's key attributes are primacy, magnitude, cost, secularity, quality, and uniformity. My emphasis on uniformity may seem odd because so much bibliographical scholarship emphasizes the book's inconsistencies. But almost all those inconsistencies are microscopic or invisible in a single copy. For most readers for 4 centuries, the experience of reading the folio has been an experience of uniformity. All the pages were printed on what a contemporary called the best crown paper. Unlike the 1647 Beaumont and Fletcher folio, the 1623 folio was manufactured by one printer, which gives it the typographical uniformity of a single printer's stock of metal types. Unlike Johnson's 1616 folio, the 1623 folio is limited to one genre, plays performed by professional actors. All those plays are secular, not saints' plays, not biblical histories. Most characters are explicitly identified as male. In every play but All's Well, the first speaker is male, and in All But As You Like It, the last speaker is male. Only a few are non-European. Many important Jacobean plays were set in contemporary London, and every live performance of any play occurs in the present tense of a present place and audience. But for readers, the folio plays all represent another place and or another time. None is limited to London. None of the events they dramatize can be dated later than 1533, the baptism of Elizabeth and Henry VIII. In 1623, Shakespeare was already a dead white male who wrote mostly about other dead white males in plays performed entirely by white males, published by a syndicate of white males. None of the 36 is pure prose, only 2 are pure verse. All are printed in double columns, separated by a vertical line within an inked box frame. Each play begins on a new page with a horizontal ornamental woodcut above a large font title. Below every title is a boxed actus primus or actus primus scena prima. Every play ends with finis or exeunt omnes, and sometimes both exeunt omnes and finis. That is, every play begins and ends with Latin, framing Shakespeare's English plays with the authority of classical culture. But although many of them are explicitly set in classical or medieval Europe, they all fundamentally differ from classical or medieval plays. The first folio uniformity effect also depends in part on what it lacks. It omits Shakespeare's poems. And unlike Johnson's 1616 folio, it omits a date and cast of first performance. In other words, the folio uniformly dehistoricizes and de-theatricalizes Shakespeare's plays. The folio made it possible to imagine that Shakespeare was a literary dramatist. All these kinds of uniformity reinforce the book's central claim that all the words of all the plays were written by one man. Shakespeare is named 20 times in the 11 pages of the folio prelims. As Amy's already pointed out, the folio constructs a model of solitary, monolithic authorship that is inaccurate. To this false claim about uniform authorship, the folio adds a false claim about uniform textual authority. Before, you were abused with diverse stolen and surreptitious copies, maimed and deformed by the frauds and stealths of injurious impostors that exposed them. Even those are now offered to your view, cured and perfect of their limbs, and all the rest absolute in their numbers as he conceived them. Donald Trump's lawyers, or A.W. Pollard, could argue that this sentence is not a deliberately misleading wholesale condemnation of all previous printings of Shakespeare's plays. As in Florida politics, everything depends on how we interpret the word diverse. In 1623, the 7 letters D-I-V-E-R-S-E might mean some, implying that this commendation applies only to a few bad quartos. That is not the only or most likely meaning of the word. Diverse could also mean different or evil or at different times or various or many. The folio does not admit that diverse previous printings were excellent. Instead, it contrasts the diverse texts that readers could have bought before with its own uniformly cured, perfect, absolutely authorial, true original copies. In terms of authorship, censorship, textual transmission, scene division, stage direction, spelling, and punctuation, the folio is a miscellany pretending to be a monolith. There is no discernible logic to the order in which the comedies or tragedies are printed. The histories reflect the chronological sequence of reigns, which encourages us to read them sequentially, but that is not the order in which they were written or performed, and the fact that some parts of a miscellany are logically arranged only emphasizes the fact that most of it is not. You can see the medley beneath the monolith even in the famous engraved title page portrait, which you've already seen. It emphasizes most conspicuously the central claim of a single author. But that face, and the head more generally, actually takes up less space than the clothes. Moreover, as art historians and lesser mortals have pointed out, the naked head is disconnected from the clothed body. The engravings consist of two parts which do not fit each other and apparently come from different sources. By contrast, the head, clothed body, book, and cushion of the Shakespeare monument in Holy Trinity Church are literally a monolith. They were cut from a single stone. But in both the engraving and the monument, Shakespeare's clothes are a composite of different fabrics and forms made by different people. In Stratford, a black gown over a red doublet, the underlying shirt showing as a white falling collar and white cuffs. In the folio, a doublet decorated with rows of silk and or metal lace to provide a contrast with the darker fabric, surmounted by a wide starched linen collar held out around the neck by a supportasse stiffened with wire, whalebone, or pasteboard. As Anne Rosalind Jones and Peter Stallybrass proved more than 20 years ago, Renaissance clothes were piecemeal assemblages of parts. So were Renaissance plays. John Kerrigan, in describing Shakespeare's originality, emphasized that all early modern actors did not just walk, but acted walking. The structure of the early modern theater, as demonstrated by backstage plots and by the scenarios that playwrights sold to acting companies, can be defined as an alternating succession of walking costumes. One costume or a group of costumes walks onto the stage, then later walks off the stage, at which point another costume or group of costumes walks onto the stage. The alternating costumes cost more than the actors who wore them, and one costume could cost more than all the words all those actors spoke. That alternating structure facilitated collaborative playwriting. It also shaped the popular forms of early English theater, which required visual variety and interwoven double plots rather than the neoclassical focus on unity of time, place, action, genre, audience, and affect. As personal, governmental, and theatrical inventories demonstrate, the assemblages of Renaissance clothing were regularly translated, their word, we'd say transformed, by changing some of their parts. In Shakespeare's case, the conspicuous white collar in the engraving and the monument would have been replaced more often than the doublet, because the white would get worn and dirty much faster than the darker, thicker doublet. Like old costumes, old plays could be updated and translated by inserting new additions without needing to create or buy something entirely new. For example, take a soldier, take a king, Henry V. A quarto was published in 1600, and another, longer version was included in the folio. Scholars disagree about the relationship between the two texts. It was probably performed for Queen Elizabeth, but it was certainly performed for King James at court on January 7, 1605. The quarto version is indisputably Elizabethan. The folio might also be, but the 1605 court performance must have been in some respects Jacobean. Costumes new in 1599 would be worn out or unfashionable, especially at court, 6 years later, and an indoor court performance might feature more and richer costumes. The cast must have changed. Burbage was probably still playing Henry, but Holger Syme has demonstrated that Burbage's company went through a personnel crisis just before King James became its new patron, due to a combination of deaths, retirements, transfers to other companies, and a cadre of boy actors aging out of their apprenticeships. But did that new cast perform an unchanged text? In an important recent essay, Murat Uçu has recently re-examined Folio Henry V from the perspective of that 1605 performance, and I think the evidence for adaptation is even stronger than he suggests. In at least two scenes, the folio is very unlikely to represent what King James heard that night. Famously, the chorus after Agincourt compares Henry to the general of our gracious empress from Ireland coming, bringing rebellion, broach it on his sword. Those lines are not in the quarto, but they must have been written before the accession of James and must have been cut in the 1605 court performance. Likewise, James would have been insulted by the debate in Act 1 about how to invade France without being stabbed in the back by the weasel Scot. Those 86 lines have often been cut in theatrical revivals, and they would certainly have been vetoed by the Master of the Revels in 1605. So the folio contains at least 93 lines that cannot have been written for or spoken in the Jacobean court performance. But that does not mean the lines would have been literally cut out of the manuscript or overwritten to make them illegible. Other printed plays contain passages that duplicate or contradict adjacent passages. Folio Henry V could too. If some lines were deleted to please King James, others might have been added to please him. One possible addition is Captain Jamie, who is not present in the quarto. As Tom Berger long ago pointed out, Jamie is completely detachable from the one scene in which he appears. Shakespeare sources don't put any Scots in Henry's army at Hertford or Agincourt, though the Irish Captain MacMorris would have been topical in 1599 or 1602. Shakespeare had no reason to interpolate an unhistorical Scotsman. But in 1603, King James declared himself king of what he called Great Britain, and in 1604 he began the parliamentary process to make that united kingdom a permanent legal entity. The folio scene that brings together on stage an English, Welsh, Irish, and Scots captain, all belonging to one army, is the first known dramatization of a union of those four nations. And unlike the maniacally violent, quick-tempered MacMorris, Jamie is not a joke or a threat. The English and the Welsh captains praise him. No one criticizes or mocks him. He does not start any arguments. His ethnicity would have been signaled sartorially, but James and his entourage brought plenty of genuine Scots clothing to London, making used, authentic Scottish gear available to acting companies. The King's men must have acquired some for their lost December 1604 play on the Gowrie conspiracy. Jamie does have an accent, but it is not necessarily demeaning. In 1605, the role could have been played by and written for Lawrence Fletcher, an actor who had come south with King James and who was identified in 1603 as a charter member of the rechristened King's Men. As an actor who had lived and worked for years in Edinburgh, Fletcher could have played Captain Jamie in front of the king and other Scots members of the Jacobean court in a way that was recognizable and affectionate without parody or mockery. Fletcher might also have played the Duke of Burgundy, a tiny part in the quarto that is massively expanded in the folio. Like Jamie, Burgundy appears in only one scene. But folio Burgundy dominates the beginning of the final scene with a long, poetic, powerful speech in praise of peace. There's nothing comparable in Shakespeare's sources, and England was at war throughout the last 15 years of Elizabeth's reign. But King James ordered a cessation of hostilities shortly after his accession, and in August 1604 concluded a peace treaty with Spain. The king's men, including Shakespeare, were present as royal servants at the ceremonial signing of that treaty. Another character who appears in only one scene and speaks only in the folio is the Queen of France, who, like Burgundy, advocates for peace in the final scene. She is the last non-English character to speak, and in 1605 was almost certainly played by a boy actor new to the role. The change of actor would have facilitated a change in the part. In 1605, England had both a king and a queen, who, like Henry and Catherine, were born in different countries and united by a negotiated dynastic marriage. The folio queen's praise of both marriage and dynastic unions, God, the best maker of all marriages, would have pleased Queen Anna much more than Queen Elizabeth. There's more to say about these and other passages that seem more appropriate to James in 1605 than to Elizabeth in 1599, but it should already be clear that we cannot simply assume, as the folio asserts, that the 1623 text of Henry V represents a single, unified act of composition, or that all its parts were intended to be performed together. There are 3 versions of Henry V, and 2 of them are combined in the folio. The 1623 text of Henry V, like the book in which it appears, is a medley. That folio celebrates the great variety of readers, but denigrates the great variety of texts. Its claims to uniform authorship and its condemnation of earlier printings have encouraged an editorial and critical search for purity, for a unified one-parent canon consisting of one-version works, which misrepresents early modern composite play production and its most successful patchwork playwright. Shakespeare's plays, like Shakespeare's clothes, were designed to be easily recycled by new actors for new audiences. Sometimes, as in Sir Thomas More in The Spanish Tragedy, he recycled other men's plays. Sometimes, as in King Lear and Henry V, he recycled his own. Sometimes, as in Macbeth and Measure for Measure, his texts were recycled by another playwright. And that process did not stop in 1623. Shakespeare's daughter Judith was still alive when Shakespeare's female characters began being recycled for and by female actors. 19th century actresses recycled Romeo and Hamlet. 19th and 20th century black men recycled roles originally played by white men in blackface. In 2003, Adrian Lesser recycled Henry V as a black Briton leading what looked like an invasion of Iraq. When our actors and our students recycle Shakespeare's characters by redressing them in black, Latinx, Asian, and trans bodies, they are doing to Shakespeare's plays what Shakespeare built his plays to do.
What a thought-provoking trio of papers. We have our microphone set up for questions. If you would prefer to raise your hand, we can bring the microphone to you. I don't know, speechless. Words, words, words. Well, I'll ask a first question as the panel chair. I was very intrigued. All three papers work from the premises of a subgenre of speculative fiction, and that is alternative histories. You all asked in one form or other, what would have happened? What would have happened if the folio hadn't been published? What would have happened if it had been published in another guise? And what would have happened in relation to adaptations, including right up to our present day? So I'm just going to give all of you a general question. You can answer it however you will. And if you could address perhaps some of the, I have some students who, and none of us feel this way, but I have some students who might think it might have been better for the first folio to have never been compiled. After they leave my class, they say otherwise. They say, I never liked Shakespeare, but now I can see the possibilities. But could you all have had that experience, but could you please just reflect what is enabling about your approach to this 400th anniversary of the first folio through this question, what would have happened if, and what might be limiting?
Can you hear me? Okay, great. What would have happened if the folio had been put together or constructed in a different way? My own research is particularly interested in how it constructs authorship and ideas of authorship, and it really makes a definitive statement about Shakespeare as a single author, and because of that, it creates this model as a starting point. And I think that there could have been alternative ways of presenting the folio. There could have been ways of publishing Shakespeare's plays that connected Shakespeare with a collaborator, such as Wilkins or Fletcher, during his lifetime. And the folio resolutely does not do that, and nor do any of the playbooks published during Shakespeare's lifetime. And so I think that's a very significant first step for everyone and for all students. It's we begin with Shakespeare as a single author, and it certainly could have been very, very different. So I think the one thing that I'm keen to do with my own research is to frame the starting question in a different way, and to think about. I mean, it's all dependent on notions of absence and loss, and to really try to foreground that absence and loss and what we don't know, and in some ways what is unknowable, but nevertheless to kind of encourage students and also in our own research to acknowledge the unknowability of a lot of the questions that the folio quite neatly ties up.
Can you hear me? I think I would agree with Amy a lot. This distortion of single authorship certainly is very prevalent. If the folio wasn't published, maybe we would get rid of the question, which I find very, very annoying and very prevalent: did Shakespeare write Shakespeare? And to that, the question, the answer is, well, I mean, I don't care whether it was actually Shakespeare, but we know this was written by one person, this was in collaboration, and this huge discourse in public, and so many articles have been written about this, so many people feel obsessed about it a bit. I would really appreciate if the dialogue between the books and the readers, the audience, was a bit more complex and acknowledged this just much more frequently. So theatre programs, for example, might really try to foreground this, and that would also give visibility to the writers who used to be really prominent, like Fletcher, in the Bowman and Fletcher Folio. Shakespeare, Johnson, and Fletcher are called the triumvirate of wit, and now suddenly we end up with Shakespeare as this monument. So that would be my response.
I think it was a good thing that the folio was published. I'm in favor of having all 36 plays. We can write our own introductions. Most of our students don't read the prelims anyway. Most of them don't read all 36 plays in that order. So that what matters about the folio is the plays that are in it, the texts that are in it, and we can reframe those in any way we want. I just wish that there had been a Middleton folio so I could complain about what was wrong with its prelims and its printing, and I could attend the Middleton Association of America.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for this wonderful talks that you've presented. And all three of you had talked some about paratextual materials in the first folio. And I have a question about the character lists. And I know, like Jitka, you've done some wonderful writing in recent years on character lists, but this is open to any of you. I'm wondering about the 4 character lists that we get in the first folio. That the only quarto that appears with a character list, I think, is the Merchant of Venice from 1633. And so the first folio is the first character lists for any Shakespeare play. And there are just the 4 of them. They all appear at the end of the plays. Othello has those interesting descriptions of the characters. So as some of the mention in the talks included the lack of actors lists, I was wondering any thoughts on those character lists, why the 4, why those 4, that kind of thing. Thank you.
It would have been so much easier if there were character lists for all the plays, of course. Also because one would have more to study, complain, try to figure it out. I love character lists, the insane organization which really does not prioritize the significance of the characters. I love, and I continue being amazed by the fact that in Shakespeare's time, you would have gone to watch the third part of Henry VI and have no idea who actually is there. And this was quite distant history, so it's not automatic that people would have understood how people were changing factions. So that's when Amy talked about losses and absences. This is something which we almost don't realize with the folio, that this is not there, because every single time we buy a playbook, we do have the character list, and it's a huge philosophical question. Who are the characters? Why are they called this way? With the Merchant of Venice, the quarter that was mentioned, Jessica is not identified by her religion, is that retrospective reflection of her conversion, for example. So it's a fantastic thing. I wish there were more character lists in the folio. Would you like to address that?
Yeah, I think the list of actors in the folio contributes to the unification effect. It imagines that there is only one theater company that performed and originated all of these plays, and so it lists, all the sharers or most of the sharers from that company, as though Shakespeare didn't write anything before that company was formed. And of course, that company is represented by Hemmings and Condell, and so you get the impression of one book, one author, one theater company, and as opposed to the very interesting variety of character lists in the period as a whole, including in Middleton's plays. And the few that are in the folios seem mostly there to fill up space.
Yes, just to add quickly about the kind of the page filling function of the character lists and how this perhaps contrasts with some of the earlier character lists, for example, in Decca's The Whore of Babylon, and the list which begins the playbook, again having a kind of descriptive account of each of or a few of the characters and who they represent. What we find in Shakespeare's Folio and the positioning of those seems to be kind of significantly different and maybe not as attentive to the interpretive work that some of the other character lists from the period do.
One thing that sometimes gets done in Renaissance play printing, possibly to enhance the illusion or reality of single authorship, is to cut out a collaborator's work. It looks as if this happened with Tamburlaine, since the comic scenes that were cut out don't seem characteristic of Marlowe and are mentioned in the publisher's prefatory letter. And we know this happened with Sejanus, I believe, where Johnson actually cut out a collaborator's role, the parts written by a collaborator, and rewrote them himself in order to have a wholly Johnsonian Sejanus. So, do you think this happened with any Shakespeare scripts in the Folio? I've never seen this discussed, actually, but your presentations of this as a volume that's trying to enhance, in slightly misleading ways, the vision of a single creator and a single author, suggests that maybe this ought to have happened somewhere, but as far as I don't know where it did, if it did.
One of you can answer, and then we'll go on to the next questions. No one needs to answer.
I think that Shakespeare was most likely to have cut out other playwrights' writing in his adaptations of other writers' plays. I think it's more likely to have happened in the theater than to have happened in the Folio. Because there's certainly evidence of other writers in the plays in the Folio.
Just quickly to take an example of Macbeth, which seems to kind of, drop in and announce the contributions of Middleton and kind of present that, or not want to erase the fact that this is revised at a later stage and involves songs that were added by Middleton.
I really liked your attention, Gary, to the material conditions of the early 17th century with clothing, and the kind of piecemeal conditions of the clothes can allow us to think of the Folio as piecemeal. And this is just an invitation to everyone to think, what are the material conditions of our moment now that are enabling you all to conceptualize of the Folio in these new ways? I was thinking of Wikipedia as this contingent, authoritative source that seems like somewhat uniform, but it is collaboratively authored. But I'm interested to hear what you all were thinking.
I think this is a good point, and in a way, even Ibo, the way it is structured and the idea it gives us about the publishing landscape, again, what survived, what was the prominence. We get something from the prominence of particular works. Everything is available there, so Shakespeare's Folio and a pamphlet from the Civil War basically has equal status, at least at first sight, unless we go into the details. And I think this really quite distorts our perception of how the landscape, what it looked like. And it's a huge problem for students who really struggle to understand this. And it goes back to my point about being lucky, privileged to be able to access these books, how geographically determined it is, funding, all that. And in a way, it would be nice if these obstacles didn't really affect our research.
Yeah, thank you for the thought-provoking papers. My question is also kind of involving these hypotheticals we've been circling around, the what-ifs. Do you think this book could have been produced in Shakespeare's lifetime, right? Given the artistic liberties that sharers and stationers took in framing Shakespeare's authorship, would it have been possible during his lifetime? Obviously, there's this understanding that he accepted, there was the shareholders, he accepted increasing use of his name in print, as Luke Stern has argued, and it was kind of a strategy. But would this same kind of narrative framing have been accepted or possible? Or, would he have just kind of taken the same do what you do to the sharers approach? So, again, a hypothetical, but would it have been possible?
Just to respond to this hypothetical. I think it could have been possible during Shakespeare's lifetime. Various questions related to ownership of copy and the stationers who may or may not have been willing to surrender or to cooperate with a syndicate in publishing it. But I do think that what we see prior to the Folio is an interest in or construction of Shakespeare as a singular author. So I don't feel that there's a significant shift in terms of what happens in the 1623 Folio. So hypothetically, perhaps Shakespeare would not have objected. And of course, we have the response with the Passionate Pilgrim issue, where Hayward kind of talks about the Shakespeare and this sense of kind of possessive authorship or concern about attribution. So, with the evidence that exists, perhaps yes, hypothetically. I don't know what both of you think.
If Shakespeare had really, really wanted a big book containing all of his writing, given his status and the fact that he's fairly wealthy and he had access to all the manuscripts that the company had, I don't see any reason he could not have done this, which to me is an indication that he probably didn't want to. But that's a guess. Everything else I said is absolutely certain. I just want to distinguish that as a guess.
We're at 5 p.m., but we have 3 people with questions, so we'll have them ask questions, and we understand if you need to leave. And then if anyone else has questions after these 3, you can approach the speakers after the plenary.
This is the post-credit scene. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. So my question is not bibliographical or even particularly intellectual. It struck me as I was listening that we already did this in 2016. That there were a bunch of folios around the United States. You remember that? They took one. That was like 1,000,000 years ago. So my question is actually unfairly existential. I want to ask the panel to reflect on, because a lot's changed since 2016. A lot's happened since then, and yet we're here, we're sort of, and like within 10 feet of me are 3 people who wrote a book on the Folio in that year. So I wondered if the panel can reflect on what might be anew, even in 7 years' time, since the last time that we did this.
Questions get harder and harder.
Or not. What's that?
At the Shakespeare Conference in 2016, I wouldn't have been able to include jokes about Donald Trump or Governor DeSantis.
And I think now, something that Jitka has mentioned earlier and in her talk as well, that now in a kind of, if we can say post-COVID or still COVID world, I think we're even more aware of kind of questions of access and being able to handle copies of the folio and being able to travel to conferences and have these kinds of conversations. And I think in 7 years from now, I think some of those questions won't go away, and in a helpful way starting to think about how we can increase access to these kinds of events for people who can't travel or again, don't feel that they should travel for climate change reasons and other needs. And so I hope in 7 years from now we'll be embracing the range of technologies that are available to make that access wider, and including things like digitization and free digitization of materials, and making access to copies more available.
I would just say really quickly, joking apart, can we really be asking in Minneapolis what has changed since 2016 in our field? A lot has changed, and I think thinking about how bibliography, book history, editing take on those challenges which have been long awaited in Shakespeare studies. I think I get that this is funnier than my answer, but it feels to me that is the ultimate transformation in our field, and that's why this work needs redoing. Yeah.
Provocation. So 2 more questions.
I was just curious about the chorus in Henry V, and the speculation about the chorus in Lohengrin, and if you had any thoughts about Shakespeare's writing choruses.
It seems to me pretty clear that the chorus, I still believe that the choruses were written in 1599, but what I believe now that I did not believe when I edited the play in 1982 or even in 2016 is that the folio text is not necessarily a representation of that 1599 play.
So just, I guess, a final question. Since your unification argument is very compelling and all 3 of you put it forward very strongly, my question to this is, do you see it as primarily, what's the motive? Is it primarily economic? We can sell more if it's got one brand name, it's focused, one company, one dramatist, everything you need, all one volume? Or is it primarily cultural? Obviously it's both, right? But I'd just be interested, since you've all thought very much about this, where you saw that coming down. Because this unification is happening. The question is why? Thank you.
Go ahead. Yes, well, in a way, there is a unification of dual authorship, this duo of Beaumont and Fletcher, and that's almost an inversion of that. So the answer is, I think it's cultural, because we know with Beaumont and Fletcher it wasn't an equal proportion in their collaboration. Beaumont died so much earlier, and even when you look at the materiality of the folio, the number of commendatory poems out of the 34, it's overwhelming that it's Fletcher. So you have got a brand, but it is not fulfilled, and it's a trademark. But when you look at evidence, you see that it wasn't equal, and yet the brand prevailed, and even these days.
Editions of classical authors, of course, are always one, right? It's just Virgil. It's not Virgil and people who helped Virgil out. So yeah.
And just quickly, I think a lot of it is also to do with marketability in the book trade, and the fact that it's almost a kind of accidental unification. I sort of hesitantly put it that way, in that
gradually, kind of year by year, it seems to emerge that putting Shakespeare's name on the title pages of playbooks help to sell them, potentially. We don't, again, know exactly the agency behind that, and that the early books were not early editions of Shakespeare's plays were anonymous, and that this in some ways just builds and grows, and so that model, that unification, perhaps presents itself as the best economic, the best marketable model for his plays.
I think it always has to be two. It always has to be both. After all, Shakespeare lived his entire life in a monarchy. So did all of these booksellers. So there is a very strong sense that authority is singular, and it should be singular. And of course, the most famous and most influential book published in the reign of James is the King James Bible, which is entirely based on the myth that it was all written by one author, God. So this notion that authority is always singular is profoundly cultural and political, and as well as economic. You excuse your economic greed in terms of an ideology that says it always needs to be one ring to rule them all. So.
Well, what a note to end on. Let's thank these three speakers.